What's up, guys? Good to see you guys again. Glad we're here in this context and this morning. We talked last night about these significant shifts. If we're going to be a disciple making, if we're going to be a movemental kind of church, and shifting your thinking is sometimes really difficult. A few months ago, I had the talk with my son Carson. And you might be thinking I'm talking about sex. I'm not. I'm not talking about, we had that years ago because you got to start early with these days and age. So the talk that I had with my son was helping him to understand women and specifically the women in our house. Is this working? Perfect. Awesome. So what, as my son, he's 11, what he began to realize is that fundamentally the way that he saw the world was different than his sister and his mother. And so my son, if you were to think about his Myers-Briggs, at least his, a couple of his, he's an I in, and so he is, he's an NT, which means he's a rational. And he thinks rationally, and both my wife and my daughter are really hardcore feelers. And so he's getting into this context at 11 years old where he's watching the world of thinker and feeler collide. And so my daughter, she is just incredibly intuitive, high feeler, just brilliant when it comes to emotions. But we're watching them kind of interact, and all of a sudden there's these realities that are unmistakable realities where something happens and she states an alternative reality and his mind is just blown. So my daughter will come up and say, Carson hit me. And Carson's like, what are you talking about? How is this true? And it's like his mind is absolutely blown. And so we get to the bottom of it, and in fact, he did not hit her, but the words that he used were as if he had hit her. And I'm helping him to understand what they feel is real, even if it's not real. And so this is this reality that feelings are real, even if it's not really real. And his that makes no sense in the world, you know. And so I'm explaining to him the fundamental difference between thinker and feeler, between helping him understand that there's this whole other world of feelings, right? And so just helping my 11-year-old understand this as a rational thinker. He sees this entire scenario and he says, well, this is the facts, Dad. And I was like, the facts don't matter in this context, right? Because we're dealing and he doesn't quite use these words, but he's like, we talk about rationality, and he's like, that's not rational. And I was like, son, you've got to understand that it's sometimes, he said, that's absolutely true that it's not rational. He said, so he doesn't use the word irrational, but he said, so all these people are not rational people, right? So this whole category. And he's just having this moment. And I said, yes, there are many people who are irrational. And what you have to understand is irrationality in some things are very good. Like the way that your sister and your mother choose to have love is irrational sometimes, and it's beautiful. But what he has to understand is the massive shift. So I'm saying all this to help saying there's these moments where you have this thing where everything makes sense in your world, and then all of a sudden something enters into it, and it's radically different. And sometimes you're just like, okay, I don't know any of this. This makes no sense to me. I need to figure out what is up and what is down. And I believe that we're in a place that we're really all over the place. For some of you, specifically those who have no church background and those maybe who have come to faith and resonate, that when we talk about this, there's a natural understanding about this. There's a natural impulse. And when they write about churches that multiply and churches that create movement, this idea is this reality that Oftentimes, there's this sense of disciple making, of movement making, of going that is so ingrained into the life of that church that they would have to try not to make disciples, that they would have to try not to plant churches. They would try to not, or they would have to try not to do all of these things. And the key in this is really this moment of being able to say, what is the natural impulse for us? And my desire is that we would become people whose natural impulse would model the natural impulse of Acts, model the natural impulse of the first 30 years of Christianity, that this would be the normative way, but that's going to require some shifts in our thinking. And I want to get into some of those things. A few weeks ago, our pastors got together and we just began to say, what is it that we need to do that if we do these things, if we put our focus on these things, if we say we're going to say yes to these things, are going to create an unstoppable movement. Really, if we just do this, if nothing else works out, but we do these things, how will we plant churches in droves? How will we reach 21 by 21 and go beyond that? How is it that the next 10 years of our church creates an indelible mark on not just the college campuses, but the cities across the Northwest? And we came up with two things. One of them is this idea of missional disciple making. Missional disciple making. And if you don't have something to write with and write on, this is going to be helpful in this time together. The second one is our leadership pipeline. Basically, we're saying this. If we do nothing else but be able to say we're going to make missional disciples, then all of our strategies and all of the pathways and all of the vehicles really don't matter if we just get to that context. And the other thing is this, if there's a mass of leaders that is behind that if our pipeline for being able to say we're going to help every single person not to progress all the way to the end of the pipeline, but wherever they're at in the pipeline to begin to multiply that and to be able to pull everybody to the highest capacity that they have as a leader, then this is an unstoppable force of the gospel. And this is this idea that we want to be in this moment doing something that is very intentional. And part of us having this LLC is to bring us all in this room to say there's a definitive shift that we're going to make and that we're going to put. And I want you to hear this all together in this room as we begin to talk about this. That going back to last night, that these dominoes and pressing these dominoes and making sure that we are lining up the dominoes for a massive movement at the end of this, at the end of our lives, whatever that looks like, there's got to be a progression. And if we don't understand the progression, then we're going to ultimately lose the power behind this. And over the last 10 years, we've been in some ways intentionally unbalanced to be able to swing something that has been dramatically shifted in a direction of addition to be able to push this into multiplication. And so we set forward 21 by 21 to plant churches on an urgent multiplying collegiate church planting movement, that idea, in order to begin to help orient us to be able to know what is up and what is down. But I want to tell you, this is the hope that we have, is that what we've begun to lay out in terms of this multiplication, and many of you here are a product, you're here because of that multiplication. But thus far, this idea has really been kind of just put into a place here. I'm doing this. This is the cage, right? So, okay, you might have already written this down already. We've had this little band of people, these special forces that have gone out to plant churches. And that's good. And this is a part of what we want to see happen. The thing we're talking about in these next few moments and for the rest of today is trying to go from special forces to everyone. What we have seen done in the superstars, what we've seen done in a few people, we want to see done in every person. So if you know your history, when the Allies in World War II, when the Allies began to realize that they couldn't stay just fighting in the seas and fighting on on our land, but we had to go conquer Europe. That there was all kinds of special forces that went in to do specific missions, but at some point, unavoidably, D-Day had to happen. And D-Day is the largest deployment in a single battle that has ever been seen in the entire world, where an armada of ships began to approach the French coast, right? And against a massive amount of firepower, and with incredible casualties. This had to be done because to win the war, at some point, no longer could just special forces do this. It had to be every person who is deployed in this group of people called the Allied forces had to be pressed into the battle to be able to take this. That's the idea that we're going to be talking about. That's the idea that's behind all of this. That when we begin to see what we can do, what does it take? What are the shifts that have to happen in order for D-Day to happen against the lostness on college campuses and in our cities in the Northwest? And so I want to get this, and I want for us to understand what this looks like in terms of shifts. And so here's the first one. The first shift that we've got to understand, and you heard this from this language already from Preston this morning, is this idea that there needs to be a shift in the hero story for the primary leader, from being a hero to becoming the mentor who creates heroes that become mentors. Now that's a little wordy, but I want you to get this reality, that when we think about typical Christendom is that there's a few groups of people, there's a few people that are kind of the special forces, right? That are on a staff that are hired to do the ministry, and then other people come and consume the ministry that the people who are paid to do the ministry are doing. This is no longer a way that's feasible in order to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. What we have to understand is how we see people who are hero makers and not heroes themselves. That their identity in the world is not how do I gather people around me, how do I gather people around my thing, how do I bring them to my village, but I begin to think through how is it that I primarily see myself as an equiper and an empowerer of other people to begin multiplicity of villages, a multiplicity of house churches and huddles and grow groups across our campuses and our communities in order to make a significant dent in the lostness. See, you have to understand that true hero makers die to themselves and are willing to live in the shadows of others, faithfully embracing the role of the supporting character. Now, I want you to understand that your pride must die in this. That at the end of the day, there's a part of us that wants to be seen as that person who has the influence, that seen as this person who has, that all eyes point to us, that we begin to get the glory in this. But here's the thing, they don't seek to be the central figure in the main plot. Instead, their main plot is to make heroes who make heroes that make heroes. That was a typo, but it's just, we'll call it gangsta. And so that make heroes. And so this is this reality for us. That you're saying, okay, there needs to be a fundamental change. See, last night, as Josh was talking, I think the one thing, if we only do one thing, if only you come out of this with one behavior, and that behavior is to take responsibility for those around you to become heroes, then we've already had a significant win in Resonate Church. If you say, I'm going to make 3 heroes this year, not just 3 heroes, but I'm going to make 3 hero makers. I'm going to make 3 people. I'm going to help to leverage my life in every moment that I have that is not already taken by the things that are unmovable in my schedule, to be able to pour into say, I'm going to make you a hero maker. I'm not going to point you to myself. I'm not going to hope that you stay in my huddle. I'm not going to hope that you stay in my village. I'm going to hope that you begin to go out and do something significant outside of this context. And so if you do this and you don't do much else, I think that you will have a significant win. And I'll show this mathematically at the end. That you would have a significant win. But if you say, man, I'm in charge of this program, and I'm in charge of this event that happens, and I'm in charge of making this event a really high level event, and this event needs to be really good so that people begin to think highly of me and my leadership, you could run yourself ragged and actually do very little for the kingdom of God. You could do a lot of work and you could put a lot of effort into something that actually doesn't make a significant dent in the kingdom of God. You must put your effort in the right place for you to be a hero maker. So let me think about this. What are some of the practices of hero? And I'm going to go through these really quick. What are the practices of hero making? One is this idea of multiplication thinking. For you to begin to think not about addition, how many people can you put on your roster, but how many people can you send out from your roster? How many people can you deploy, not just how many people can you gather? Now, what you have to do is you have to gather people first. So let's be clear about that. Multiplication begins with addition, but it doesn't end with addition. Multiplication thinking. The next one is permission giving. To be able to say, you can do this. To be able to say yes to them. We'll get into this just a little bit more in just a minute. To be able to multiply disciples, to be able to think multiplication for your disciples. So not just making disciples, but multiplying disciples. To think about activating the gifts of the people around you. And so that you begin to say, okay, the kingdom of God needs to be present in our midst. That we need to figure out what the gifts are of the people around me. And you begin to say, okay, the best thing that I have to do is I begin to look around and say, how is it that everyone has a role to play? And you look and you begin to discover and you begin to extract out of them the unique calling that God has put in them to be able to make a significant impact upon the community that's there and the community outside of that house church. And so you begin to say, man, you're really good at this. Help us with this. All throughout, I really believe that evangelism is a team sport. We've talked about the idea that some people are connectors. They bring people in naturally. They're just evangelists, and they want to make sure that everybody knows that this thing that they're a part of is the best thing ever. There's other people that are great cultivators. So you have connectors. You have cultivators. You have people that go deep with people in relationship. They don't like to have a lot of relationships, but they like to have deep relationships. And so use that to your advantage. You have other people that are great communicators, that they can articulate things really clearly that other people can't. So when you begin to bring people and make evangelism a team sport, what you begin to see is connectors bring people in, cultivators deepen the relationship, communicators help clarify the worldview that you operate by. And when that happens, everyone has a role to play and it's in their sweet spot. Let's play in a context where you're developing the sweet spots for everybody and you're creating a synergistic force in your house church, in your village. What it looks like is this: when you begin to think about some of these hero making, that might be a little small, but heroic leadership versus hero making leadership is how you think, see, share, bless, and count. So if you begin to think about a multiplication thinker thinks, I think ministry happens through my own leadership versus I think ministry happens through multiplied leaders. Permission giving is I see what God can do through my own leadership instead of seeing what God can do through others, and I let them know what I see in them. Let me tell you that when you have a moment where you can see in somebody and say to them, here's what I see in you, it is a powerful, powerful moment when you're a vision caster to someone else's life. I think oftentimes our development gets very just arrested because no one has ever told us really who we could be. I remember being a young leader and not having any feedback from those above me, and so I would go and I would request. I would say, "Hey, can you evaluate me? Can you tell me how I'm doing? Because at the core, I really want to know some truth about where you see in me." So I had to ask of this. But what if you're a leader that routinely began to cast vision to other people about who they could become? I promise you, your words will never leave their heart. That when you say, here's who I think you can be, that next phrase, paragraph, or conversation will be just placed deeply in their heart. The same thing with cutting words. There's some language that we have that creates fundamental change. One of the things I love about this context of working with college is you actually get to create just degrees of change. You get to say, hey, there's a new trajectory for your life. And you get to say that. And I promise you, you guys in here, you're spiritual leaders of our church. And the weight of your words are significant to the people around you. And when you begin to say, I'm going to think about who you are, I'm not just going to think about you showing up, I'm going to think about really deeply who you are, what your gifts are, what your trajectory is, and to be able to speak to you and begin to say, this is who I think you can be. Let's never withhold that from the people around us. So what do you see? Disciple multipliers, I share what I've learned in ways that grow followers, or I share what I've learned in ways that multiply disciples. Gift activator, I ask God to bless the use of my own gifts versus I ask God to bless the leaders that I'm sending out. How much do you pray for the people that you have under your spiritual leadership? Kingdom builder, I count people who show up to my thing versus I count leaders who go out and do God's thing. How are you operating in this? What does it look like to be a hero maker? I want you to get that there's a massive opportunity when we begin to see ourselves not as heroes, but as hero makers. I was on the drive here, I was pondering that our original site that we started is now it's now in the bottom half in terms of weekly Sunday attendance in all of our sites. So if we think about 1,200 people on a given Sunday, the site that started all this, the site that we began with, is in the bottom half of that. It's one of the smaller sites now. Now I promise you that if that site, if Josh Martin had seen himself as primarily just a hero, that site might be significant. It might be big. It might have some significance to it that was shown outside of just resonate. Man, what a big church. But the thing is, the power behind it was that we've sent out leaders, and more things have happened outside the Palouse. And now, if you look at that, if you think about 130 people being a part of that church, but 1,300, that's 10 times more people outside of the walls of that one thing. And I believe that is the key to being able to see not only 10 times, but 100 times more people out of that. Because that one site didn't say, hey, we're going to hoard all these people. We're going to make sure all the leaders stay here. But it got sent out. And this might seem like a failure, but I understand that in kingdom math, this is a magnificent success. So the hero making, what does it look like? Second shift is a shift in the expectations for every believer, from being consumers or converts to being disciples who make disciples to the fourth generation. Massive change. We're changing the expectations. We're changing the operating system, that we're not creating things for people to come and consume, but we're ultimately saying we are taking and being able to say, for every believer, and I hope that you get this idea that's there, that you begin to see this idea of every believer, that no one's left out of being disciples who make disciples to the fourth generation. Why the fourth generation? Because you'll begin to understand what's happening in your world. You'll be able to understand that actually the things that you're doing are actually disciple-making values, language, and behavior. That you're creating a culture of disciple-making if by the fourth generation that is happening. Now, I want you to get that one of the most significant successes of 2017 was to have a third-generation church plant. For us to be able to plant Ellensburg and ultimately to plant Monmouth. Can I hear anybody from Monmouth? That right there, that sound is the sound of what third generation is like, for people to be able to be sent out that send out. And I want you to get that the very nature of that, what we've seen even in Monmouth is just, it's incredible. As we've seen people hit the ground and automatically there's things that are happening on that campus that are displaying that there's a breakthrough in the kingdom in Western Oregon University. And it gets more and more powerful. The potency is carried on to a significant degree when we begin to think about what fourth generation. So just like what Josh said last night, that the most significant indicator of future success is being able to look back and say, this is what my leader did. I think we read the Bible, but before they had the Bible in printed form like we have, they had people that modeled the Bible. This is why Paul says, follow me. because we can't just get into the text and say, I'm just going to read my text. We realistically just have to look at the people around us. But when we combine being able to see the words of Jesus with the life of leaders, it is an amazing opportunity. So thank God for Johann Gutenberg, right? That began to help us to understand that we could get the Bible in all of our hands to be able to confirm what we see in the lives of the people around us. But if we're not careful, we can just say it's me and my DT. And we can miss the power of modeled discipleship. So if we begin to be a group of people that have deep and abiding piety in the Word, but don't get the understanding of a modeled life, we never unleash the power of the gospel. Now, we might have a deep, abiding inspiration, but please don't miss that you have to model this to the fourth generation. So what does this look like? Let me ask you this. What am I doing now to make disciples to the fourth generation? What am I doing now to make disciples to the fourth generation? Let me ask this another way. What am I doing right now that is effectively not making disciples to the fourth generation? Like, what are the most key behaviors? And over the course of this year, what we're going to try to do is we're going to see those of you who have been successful at this and begin to say, okay, what was your secret? What did you do? Because we want to make sure that we're not just saying, hey, what we're going to celebrate is, and this is the changing of the scorecard. We're going to talk about this. Hey, our village got really big, and we decided to multiply because we're really big. That's a false win. It's really good that we're adding people, but to be able to say we're going to multiply because people need to be sent out because this person is making a fourth generation disciple is a bigger win than just we had to multiply because we ran out of room. That's good, but it's not best. Because what we want to do is we want to run out of room in 100 rooms, not in one room. And the only way to run out of room in 100 rooms is to be able to intentionally begin to think fourth generation fruit. Number 3, a shift in the opportunity for every disciple. From going to church to becoming a missionary to a mission field yet to be declared. A shift. Okay, so did you get this thing that you see here? This idea of disciple. A shift in the opportunity. It was for every believer. Now this is for every disciple, right? So when you begin to understand that you are following Jesus, you're making disciples, and that you become a mission field. And I just want to tie these two words together to be able to understand that everyone is a missionary. No longer is being a missionary special forces. This is what each and every one of us that carry within us the gospel now become. And we do this because the King has given us a mission. And that mission is not just for a specific set-aside group of people, but that mission is for every single person to a mission field yet to be declared. And so we look at that and we begin to say, this is what I think in the world around me. That you begin to say, as a missionary, here's the kingdom of God and here's the world around me. And what I must do is begin to have a heart that's broken by the fact that this is what heaven looks like and this is earth. And I want to unleash the perfection on heaven to do damage and to redeem the issues here on earth. But if we're okay with the issues here on earth, then we'll never think, you know what this needs? This needs heaven. This needs to be able to be redeemed. And so I've talked with our staff about this, but I think that we have to understand the weight, not just of eternities that are going to hell, but hell on earth. And when we begin to realize that hell on earth is sexual assault, and we begin to say, hey, the church has something to say about the Me Too movement. And to be able to understand that there's something that's underneath that the church can speak to in the same way that the church spoke to racism and continues to speak to racism, that we begin to speak about what it looks like to bring heaven to earth and to be able to say, hey, this is God's intent for sexual relationships. This is God's intent for every male, for every female. and for how they are to be treated. And we begin to say, okay, underlying this, my heart is broken. And I'm not going to just say, I'm just going to go and I'm going to make an impact upon my campus. And I'm going to be able to speak to and do things that redeem the sexual dysfunction, that redeem the assault that is happening, that redeem this. But I'm going to make disciples who do this over and over. And they're going to watch me to not only make disciples, but to do something in our things that brings the kingdom of God into our campuses and our communities. But it can't just be you. It's got to be an army of you. And when it's an army of you, it creates a movement of you. And when it's a movement of you, it begins to change the very fabric of the campuses that we're on. And people go to campus and say, hey, there's something different about this. Thanks. So this is this key. There's some campuses they're going on to, and you're going to walk on those campuses. I mean, by 2019, we're going to be on some campuses that have some massive long-term sins, issues that have been embedded into the very fabric of those communities. And you have to go there with wide eyes thinking the kingdom of God has got to be displayed, but I can't do it with just me. I've got to make disciples who make kingdom impact. Okay, I've got to go on. To become disciples who make disciples, people must start thinking of themselves differently. You have to start thinking of yourself differently. I hope that we can eliminate the go-to resonate language, because that's inherently a consumeristic idea. I understand. I get it. But underneath that, can we begin to say you are resonate? You don't go to resonate. It's bigger than that. We must think of ourselves as missionaries with a church waiting to be birthed among those with whom we work, play, and live. I know this is like radical. When we begin to say, okay, what's the minimum level of ecclesiology? How many house churches can we put into different places on our campuses? Can we begin to say that everyone is a missionary, and we begin to think of ourselves as just a church that's waiting to be birthed, a house church that's waiting to be birthed among those whom we work, play, and live? Can you begin to have an idea that when you think, where does a house church need to be birthed? And you begin to walk around your campus and say, man, that dorm needs a house church. That major needs a house church. That apartment complex, this group of people needs a house church. And when we begin to say, how quickly can we get a house church there? How quickly can we get an outpost of missional disciple making that ultimately provides kingdom impact into that place? Because the kingdom of God needs to get to that place, because there's hell there and heaven needs to come. Number 4, a shift in the operation system from a bias to no to the bias to yes. Now, this is the most chaotic and messy and crazy thing we're going to say to you, is that this reality that we radically deploy people with good and bad ideas. And we say to them, go. When you see a context of hell on earth and you begin to have an idea about how heaven can be put into that the kingdom of God can come, we begin to release you. Now, the key is this. You as village leaders, you as house church leaders are going to hopefully have people that you begin to empower to go out. And as you empower people to go out, what you're going to have to make sure you do is when you hear good ideas and bad ideas, especially when you hear bad ideas, and you hear someone say, here's what I want to do, and you're like, man, thanks for trying. Thanks for thinking of something. I really wish you to spend just a little bit more time thinking of the next idea. We're not going to do that. We're not going to say no. We're going to say as leaders, yes, let me walk with you in that. It's a horrible idea. Instead of saying you shouldn't do that idea, we're going to start saying, let me help you to ultimately make this into a better idea. And I want to confess that this is, even from all of us pastors, this is pressing on us And there's been some times where we've said no, where we needed to say yes. And we want to shift our thinking and to be able to say, we don't want to be lazy and just say, no, that's a dumb idea. Yes, I'm going to figure out a way to walk with you to make that into a better idea, to make that into a high impact idea. But can you imagine, on an average, we have over 1,000 people in our villages. This year we have close to 2,700 people that have come to a small group, come to a village at least once. If we begin to deploy them out to do something, and if the number of people in this room begins to help them be able to say, let's think about the most wise way to use your gifts and skills to make sure that it has maximum impact upon our campus and community, what could happen? What could happen? I also want you to get that when you begin to deploy people and empower people, you don't have smaller villages, you don't have smaller house churches, it begins to grow. Hey, this is a place where something's happening, and we're not just gathering around to give our thoughts about some theological things, but there's something that's creating movement in our midst. I promise you, this ignites a spark in the hearts of people. Next thing, and this is the last one, the last shift is this: a shift in the scorecard from counting the number of people in any one place to the percentage of population changed. And so we're going to get into just the reality of when we begin to look at scorecard changes and we begin to say, okay, what is it that we celebrate? What is it that we count? How does that begin to change? What does that begin to look like? And how do we begin to see massive impact around just being able to say, if I begin to say I'm going to celebrate this thing, it begins to change the way that I think about my leadership. How is it that we begin to say it's not just about what's happening here, but it's what's happening in other places? It's how I begin to deploy out people. So if we think about just scorecards and we think about numbers, I took the amount of people who came to a village in 2016 and 2017. And I began to just say, okay, if we take existing numbers and if we get no better at being able to reach more people on our campuses, and we just stay static in all of this, which I hope we don't. And then if we just take the standard rate by which we're planting churches and we don't accelerate that at any, but it stays standard. When we look 9 years to the future, how many people in the year 27, 28 will have been in a Resonate house church, a Resonate village? And here's the number: 64,357 are on a roster somewhere, which means that Samantha is really busy, like typing in all those names, right? 64,000 people. 64,000 people. I want you to get what we're talking about. That if we continue to be able to say, how is it that we make disciples that make disciples, and we think a long game and we think about how this works, what does it look like for us to be able to take and look at these shifts in a long version of this? I want to give you one more context. Look at this math. And if we just think about you, and if there's 3 people that you pour your life into, then you have 3. You have 3 disciples. But what if you see yourself as not just a disciple maker, but someone who makes disciples that make disciples? And you begin to see that begins to land. And so those 3 make 3. And then those 9 make 3. And that's 27. And those 27 make 3 disciples. And that's 81. And those 81 people make 3 disciples. That's 243. Now, this is completely incomplete because it's like everybody just does this one time and they stop, right? So if you actually do the math right, it's more significant than that. But I want you to get how in 5 years, just you helping to be able to help others to make disciples has a massive effect. Has a significant effect. So if we took everyone in this room and did that math, guys, I want you to get that what Jesus started is incredibly powerful. But what it's going to take is for us to be able to look at what we're doing and fundamentally ask these 5 questions about the shifts that we're going to have. And what is it going to look like? So I want you to do this right now as we close out. I want you to just write down, is there something that you need to, is there 3 things that you say, hey, looking at these shifts, are there 3 things that maybe God is saying that I need to do? Is there something as you heard this that you need to say, hey, I need to take action towards this? I'm going to give you just about 2 minutes to begin to write 3 action steps based upon these 5 shifts, based upon what it looks like. 3 action steps. What's an immediate thing for you to be able to say, I want to start doing this right now? Go for it.